What would you do if the person meant to protect you sold you like property? This is not a story from a movie. This is a story of betrayal, courage, and the unexpected power of destiny. They say blood is thicker than water, but for her, that belief shattered the moment her stepmother sold her future for a stack of cash. She was only 19, tender and trusting, still holding on to the memory of her late father who had promised to protect her forever. After his death, she thought her stepmother would step into that role of comfort and care, filling the home with warmth and motherly affection, but instead she found herself in a house that grew colder with each passing day. What she didn't realize was that behind every soft smile her stepmother gave, there hid a calculated cruelty, a heart where greed had taken root deeper than love ever could. Her father's death changed everything. The once bustling home became quiet, except for the sound of whispered schemes. The stepmother began inviting guests, wealthy men, business partners, and family friends under the pretext of discussing estate matters. But in truth, she was showcasing the young woman like a prize. Be claimed. Every compliment, every approving glance from these visitors was a silent bid in a cruel, invisible auction. And she, the daughter of the man who had loved her more than life itself, was being priced and prepared for sale not out of necessity, but out of greed. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could. She had once believed that family was a sanctuary, a place where love was unconditional and loyalty unshakable. Yet the woman she called mother had turned that belief into a weapon. When the proposal came from the wealthy doctor, a man old enough to be her father, the stepmother didn't hesitate. She painted the offer in gold, speaking of luxury, comfort, and social prestige. But what she truly saw was opportunity, a way to elevate herself, to gain favor and fortune through her stepdaughter's misery. The young girl's protests were silenced with guilt and manipulation. "You should be grateful," her stepmother had said coldly. "Some girls never get a chance like this." Those words would echo in her mind for years to come. The wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a transaction. The ceremony was lavish, attended by high society, draped in jewels and lies. Every smile she gave in those wedding photos hid tears that no one saw. She stood beside the doctor, a man who looked at her not with affection, but with ownership. To him, she was a trophy, proof of his wealth and power. To her stepmother, she was a completed deal, a contract fulfilled. That night, as the guests toasted and the music played, she realized she had been sold not just for money, but for convenience, for pride, for status. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart, it teaches you not to trust the world at all. Days turned into weeks, and the truth of a new reality began to sink in. She had been uprooted from her world and planted in another one, gilded with luxury but stripped of freedom. Her stepmother no longer called, no longer cared. The woman who had once pretended to love her had disappeared the moment the money arrived. It was as if she had erased her from existence, satisfied that her bargain had been sealed. And though the mansion she now lived in was grand, she felt more like a prisoner than a bride. Each room echoed with emptiness. Every object reminded her of the price she had paid for someone else's greed. And yet, beneath the weight of that betrayal, something began to stir within her, a quiet, unyielding strength. She realized that the people who betray us do not define who we are, they reveal who they are. Her stepmother's deceit had stolen her innocence, but not her spirit. In the deepest corners of her pain, she found resolve not to seek revenge, but to rise above it. The betrayal that was meant to destroy her became the very fire that forged her resilience. For the first time, she began to see herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. And though her story had begun with betrayal by blood, it would one day be remembered as a tale of rebirth, of a woman who learned that even when love turns to cruelty, strength can still be born from pain. The day she was married should have been the most beautiful day of her life, a day of laughter, blessings, and dreams blooming like spring flowers. But for her, it felt like a funeral disguised as a celebration. Every detail of the wedding glittered with gold, but beneath the surface was silence, the kind that screams louder than any words. Her eyes were lined with coal and sorrow, her smile carefully painted to hide the truth. The guests saw a bride, but she knew deep inside that she was nothing more than an ornament beautifully wrapped and silently traded. Her heart was not given that day, it was taken. From the moment the ceremony ended, Her life transformed into a series of quiet imprisonments. The mansion she entered was magnificent marble floors, chandeliers like frozen stars, and walls that seemed to whisper luxury. But to her, it was a cage gilded in gold. The air felt heavy, the silence suffocating. Every step she took echoed with the memory of what she had lost: freedom, choice, and the right to her own life. Her husband, the rich and arrogant doctor, treated her with an air of superiority. He wasn't cruel with his hands, he was cruel with his indifference. Every glance was a reminder that she was not his partner, but his possession. He would come home from the hospital each evening, his expensive watch gleaming, his voice commanding, his ego filling every corner of the room. She would stand quietly, her words carefully measured, her emotions neatly folded away. He spoke to her as one speaks to an employee, never with warmth, always with authority. When she tried to speak her mind, he dismissed her with a single look, as though her opinions were irrelevant. He believed that because he provided wealth, he owned her gratitude, but what he didn't understand was that money can build a mansion, but it can never build a home. Nights were the hardest. The silence of that house echoed like a haunting. She often sat by the window, staring into the dark, wondering how her life had changed so drastically. She remembered her dreams to study, to travel, to make her father proud, all stolen by a decision she never made. She often whispered prayers into the night, not for riches, not for luxury, but for escape, for a single day where she could wake up and decide something for herself. Her only companion was the moonlight that spilled into her room, a silent witness to her tears. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The doctor's arrogance grew alongside her silence. To him, her obedience was proof of submission, but in truth, it was survival. She learned to wear stillness like armor, to smile when expected, to disappear when ignored. She became invisible in her own life, a shadow moving quietly through corridors of gold. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, something fierce was taking root. Pain has a strange way of awakening strength. In her solitude, she began to see clearly that her marriage, though forced, did not define her worth, that her silence did not mean defeat. One evening, something changed. He mocked her a cruel remark about her being lucky. He married her, and instead of crying, she looked him in the eyes for the first time and said, "Luck had nothing to do with it." It was a small sentence, but it carried years of pain, anger, and awakening. For a brief moment, he was speechless. That night, she realized the power she had been giving away all along, the power of her voice, her defiance, her dignity. From that moment, she decided she would no longer just survive. She would reclaim herself piece by piece. This was not love. This was a prison built on power, not partnership. But she would not remain a prisoner forever. Her forced marriage had stripped her of choice, but not of spirit. Every breath she took was an act of quiet rebellion. And though the world saw a submissive wife living in luxury, deep inside, a storm was forming, one that would one day change everything. Power, it has a way of making people believe they are untouchable. The doctor, her husband, was no different. His arrogance was not loud. It was calculated, refined, and suffocating. He was the kind of man who wore confidence like armor and control like a crown. In his world, money commanded respect, and emotions were considered weaknesses. Every action, every word he spoke carried an unspoken message: "You belong to me." He didn't shout or strike. His dominance was quieter, colder, the kind that made you question your own worth without ever raising his voice. He ruled his home like an empire. The servant scurried at his footsteps, afraid to meet his gaze. Every corner of the mansion reflected his success awards on the wall, luxury cars in the driveway, and the latest gadgets adorning the rooms. But beneath that glittering facade, there lived a woman slowly suffocating under the weight of his pride. He treated her not as a partner, but as proof of his social status. Whenever guests visited, he paraded her around the perfect wife with a perfect smile. Yet behind closed doors, she was invisible, her opinions dismissed as childish, her emotions labeled as overreactions. He believed that love could be bought, that loyalty could be demanded, that fear was the same as respect. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that she was not the fragile girl he imagined her to be. Each day she observed him quietly, learning his patterns, understanding his weaknesses. She noticed how his voice softened only when he spoke to patience how he craved admiration, not connection. She began to see the cracks in his armor, the insecurities hidden beneath his confidence. The more she saw, the less she feared him. It was in those silent observations that her strength began to bloom. One evening during dinner, he mocked her education, saying she should be grateful that he allowed her to live such a privileged life. That was the first time she didn't look away. Her eyes met his, steady and calm. "Privilege means nothing without respect," she said softly. For a man like him, that simple sentence was a challenge. He froze for a moment, taken aback, not by anger but by surprise. No one had ever dared to speak to him that way. That night, he didn't sleep easily. Her words replayed in his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. It was the beginning of a shift, small, almost invisible, but powerful enough to shake the foundation of his pride. In the following weeks, he found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to: her silence, her grace, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. When he spoke harshly, she didn't cry anymore. She listened, then simply walked away. That quiet defiance unnerved him more than any argument could. For the first time, he felt a strange discomfort, not from her rebellion, but from the realization that she no longer feared him. Power, he realized, was slipping away not because she took it, but because he had never truly owned it. He began to question himself, his choices, his pride, and the emptiness that surrounded his success. Still, he couldn't admit it. His ego wouldn't allow it. So he tried harder to control her, setting rules, limiting her interactions, even deciding what she should wear to social events. But the more he tried to cage her, the more radiant she became. There was a new light in her, quiet, unwavering, dangerous to his arrogance. He had built a life on dominance, but she was teaching him, without words, that real strength is not about control, it's about respect. Slowly, his arrogance began to crumble, not through confrontation, but through her resilience. For every harsh word he spoke, she answered with calm truth. For every insult, she responded with grace. And in that silent battle between pride and dignity, she was winning not by force, but by the quiet power of her soul. The arrogant doctor, once untouchable in his world of wealth and power, began to see himself through her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. The mirror of her courage reflected his flaws, his loneliness, his emptiness. He had everything money could buy, yet he realized he had nothing that truly mattered. That was the cruel irony of arrogance. It builds walls so high that even love cannot climb them. And now, standing before the woman he once owned, he began to understand the one truth he had ignored all his life. You can control a body, but you can never control a soul. There comes a moment in every story of pain when silence turns into strength. For her, that moment came quietly, not with anger, not with revenge, but with realization. One morning, as she stood by the mirror, she barely recognized the reflection staring back. The woman in the glass had endured humiliation, loneliness, and betrayal. Yet there was something unbreakable in her eyes, something her husband's arrogance and her stepmother's greed had failed to destroy. It was her spirit, bruised but not broken. She realized that no one was coming to save her, and that was when everything began to change. She started small, a whispered prayer at dawn, a hidden smile at her own reflection. She began reading again the books she once loved but had been forbidden to touch. Late at night, when the mansion fell asleep, she would open her window, feel the wind on her face, and remind herself that beyond those walls, a world still existed, one that belonged to her too. Each page she read, each breath she took in defiance of her sorrow, became a step toward rediscovery. Pain, she learned, is a teacher, and hers was teaching her how to rise. Gradually, she began reclaiming her space, not physically, but emotionally. When her husband insulted her, she didn't flinch anymore. When he ignored her, she found peace in her solitude. The silence that once felt suffocating now became her sanctuary. She stopped waiting for kindness from others and began giving it to herself. She cooked her favorite meals, wore colors he disliked, played songs that reminded her of the girl she used to be. In small, quiet ways, she began taking back her life. Her power wasn't loud, it was gentle, steady, and radiant, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. The doctor, once blinded by his own pride, began to sense something different in her. There was a calm defiance in her movements, a quiet confidence in her eyes that unsettled him. She no longer begged for affection or validation. She didn't need them anymore, and that independence, that quiet strength, was something he couldn't understand. For a man who had built his life on control, her peace felt like rebellion. She was no longer the frightened girl who had entered his home. She was becoming a woman who knew her worth, who had found her power not in his approval, but in her own self-respect. There were moments when she still cried not out of weakness, but out of release. Each tear was a thread of pain she was finally letting go. She began writing again letters to her late father, poems she would never show anyone, thoughts that gave her hope. The more she wrote, the lighter she felt. Her pen became her weapon, her paper her refuge. Through words, she rebuilt herself, one sentence at a time. Slowly, she realized that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I will not give up." One day, she stood at the window, the same one where she used to cry, and smiled. Not because her life had suddenly become easy, but because she had changed. She had learned to live in the same house that once felt like a prison, but now on her own terms. Her husband's arrogance no longer defined her. Her stepmother's betrayal no longer haunted her. The power they once had over her had vanished not because they lost it, but because she stopped giving it to them. She had discovered something rare, something no one could ever take away: self-worth. And that, she realized, was the beginning of true freedom. Change rarely happens overnight. It begins in moments so small that they almost go unnoticed: a softer tone, a hesitant apology, a look that lasts a little longer than before. In the mansion that once echoed with silence and pride, something subtle began to shift. The doctor, once consumed by arrogance and authority, found himself pausing whenever he saw her. She had changed not in appearance, but in essence. The woman who once walked with her head bowed now carried herself with quiet dignity. Her presence, calm yet commanding, filled the room in ways he could not understand. He began to realize that her silence wasn't submission, it was strength. He started observing her the way a man studies something he cannot control. She no longer reacted to his temper. When he criticized, she listened without anger. When he raised his voice, she met his eyes with composure instead of fear. That stillness disarmed him. It was as if she had built an invisible wall of peace that his arrogance could no longer penetrate. And slowly, something unfamiliar began to stir within him: respect. It was reluctant at first, uncomfortable even, but it grew stronger each day. For the first time, he saw her not as a possession, but as a person, a woman of grace, courage, and resilience. The turning point came one evening when she fell ill. He found her asleep at the table, a half-written letter beside her. He picked it up, curious, and read words that pierced through his pride. In that letter, she had written to her late father about her loneliness, her pain, and her fight to find meaning again. She hadn't written in bitterness, she had written in gratitude, thanking her pain for teaching her strength, thanking her suffering for showing her who she really was. He sat there, speechless. For years, he had believed power came from control. But now, reading her words, he realized that true power came from compassion, endurance, and forgiveness. He had spent his life healing others as a doctor, but never once had he tried to heal the woman who shared his home. The next morning, he brought her breakfast, something he had never done before. It was a small gesture, almost awkward, but it carried the weight of an unspoken apology. She looked surprised, then smiled, not out of victory, but out of quiet understanding. It was in that moment that he realized how wrong he had been. Love, he understood now, was not about dominance or pride. It was about care, kindness, and humility. He had built walls of ego, but she had broken them down with grace, not rebellion. The transformation was not just hers, it was his too. Her strength had awakened his humanity. As days passed, he began to change. He listened more, spoke less. He noticed the things he had ignored, the way she hummed while cooking, the patience in her voice, the light she brought into even the darkest corners of their home. He started to see beauty not in possessions, but in presence. She didn't demand his love. She simply lived with such authenticity that love became inevitable. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly see someone beyond appearances, beyond pride, beyond the illusion of control. Their relationship didn't transform into a fairy tale overnight, but it found truth, and that truth was more powerful than perfection. He, once the arrogant doctor who thought the world revolved around him, began learning from her humility. She, once the girl who was sold into a loveless marriage, became the teacher of empathy and grace. Together, they began rebuilding what was once broken not out of obligation, but out of choice. Her transformation became a mirror, reflecting his flaws and his potential. And as he changed, so did their world. He finally realized that wealth without warmth meant nothing, that success without kindness was failure, and that love without respect was not love at all. In the quiet strength of the woman he had once underestimated, he found redemption. The man who once believed he owned her heart had finally learned that hearts are not owned, they are earned. Every story carries a message, but this one carried many about pain, courage, forgiveness, and the indestructible strength of a woman's soul. Her journey wasn't just about survival, it was about awakening. She had been betrayed, silenced, and sold, yet she emerged not as a victim, but as a victor of her own destiny. The people who tried to break her only ended up shaping her into something stronger, wiser, and freer. Her story was a living proof that even when life hands you chains, you can still choose how you wear them, as shackles or as symbols of survival. In the quiet halls of that mansion, she learned the most important truth of all. Freedom doesn't always mean escape. Sometimes it means finding peace right where you were once trapped. She had discovered that power wasn't about wealth or status or control, it was about self-respect. The day she stopped begging for love, she found it within herself. The day she stopped fearing her husband, she began to teach him. And the day she forgave her stepmother, not for her sake but for her own healing, she realized what true liberation feels like. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant refusing to let bitterness own her heart any longer. Her story became more than a private victory. It became a silent revolution. For every woman who had been told to stay quiet, she became a voice. For every girl who believed her worth depended on someone else's approval, she became an example. Her life spoke without words. You are not what they did to you. You are what you rise from. She understood now that strength is not about how loudly you fight, but how gracefully you stand when everything around you is falling apart. The scars she carried were not signs of weakness. They were proof of her survival, a map of her becoming. As time passed, even the doctor, once proud and cold, began to share his story with others, crediting her for the transformation that changed his heart. He often said, "She didn't teach me through lectures, she taught me through silence." He had spent years studying medicine, but she had taught him humanity. Together, they became a living example that change is possible not through domination, but through compassion. Their relationship, once built on control, evolved into a partnership rooted in understanding. It was not perfect, but it was real, and that reality carried more peace than any illusion of power ever could. But the true message of her story wasn't about love or marriage. It was about reclaiming identity. She had once been a daughter sold, a wife silenced, a woman overlooked. Yet by finding her own voice, she rewrote her story entirely. She became the author of her fate. Her name, once forgotten, now stood as a symbol of resilience, proof that even in a world that tries to define women by their obedience, there will always be those who define themselves by their strength. And in that, there is victory. Her journey reminds us that a woman's spirit cannot be bought, controlled, or broken. It can only be tested. And every test reveals the truth. that within every woman lies an ocean of courage waiting to rise. She may be betrayed, but she will heal. She may fall, but she will rise. And when she does, she will not only rebuild her life, she will inspire countless others to do the same. Because in the end, her story is not just hers, it belongs to every woman who has ever been told to stay silent and chose instead to speak with her strength. And so, her story, the story that began with betrayal, did not end in tragedy, but in triumph. She was sold, yes. She was silenced, yes. But she was never defeated. The same fire that once flickered weakly in her heart had now become a flame that could light the darkness around her. She learned that real freedom isn't given, it's taken back. Real love isn't demanded, it's earned. And real strength isn't shown through anger, but through endurance. The stepmother's greed may have stolen her innocence. The doctor's arrogance may have crushed her spirit for a time. But neither could destroy her essence, the soul of a woman who chose to rise. Again and again, she proved to the world that being sold does not mean being owned, that being silenced does not mean being voiceless, and that even when the world turns its back, a woman can still stand tall, proud, unbroken, and free. Her story is not just hers. It's every woman's story, every person who has ever been betrayed, belittled, or broken, yet found the courage to heal, to grow, and to shine. Because the truth is, you can sell her body, but never her spirit. You can cage her life, but never her dreams. So remember her story not for the pain she endured, but for the power she became. Because in the end, she wasn't just the girl who was sold. She became the woman who could never again be bought.